All right, so we're diving deep today into early American history.
Sounds exciting.
It's the Whiskey Rebellion.
Okay.
And we're going to be talking about how attacks on whiskey,
Mm.
of all things, almost tore apart this brand new nation.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize how close this came to like a second revolution.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
Yeah.
And to help us unpack all this, we've got an interview with historian William Hogland.
Oh, wow.
He wrote like the definitive book on this whole thing. So
Looking forward to that.
buckle up. It's a wild ride.
So what's interesting to me about the Whiskey Rebellion
Yeah.
is that it wasn't just about whiskey or even taxes, really.
Okay.
It was more of a clash between this brand new federal government
Yeah.
trying to figure out how to assert its authority
Right.
and a population that was like deeply suspicious of centralized power.
Yeah, they had just fought a revolution to get away from that.
Exactly. They just fought a war to get away from like
Yeah.
what they saw as tyrannical rule. So you can kind of see how they might be a little on edge
Yeah, absolutely.
about the government getting too big.
So let's set the stage here a little bit.
Okay.
It's 1794. George Washington is president.
Right. The very first president.
The very first president.
Yeah.
And this young nation's just trying to figure things out.
Still finding its feet.
Yeah. And then in walks Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury.
Oh, yeah. Hamilton.
And he's got this really bold vision for the U.S. economy.
Bold and maybe a little radical for the time.
Yeah, some might say. So tell me about Hamilton. What was he all about?
He was a fascinating figure.
Yeah.
He was a staunch Federalist,
Okay.
and he believed in a strong central government.
Okay.
And he saw this new nation's debt, primarily from the Revolutionary War,
Right.
as an opportunity.
An opportunity. Most people think of debt as a bad thing.
Yeah, you'd think so, right?
Yeah.
Most people would think debt's a bad thing. But Hamilton, he saw it as a way to like unify the country, to tie everyone's interests together.
That's interesting. So instead of seeing it as a problem, he actually wanted to use the debt to build a stronger nation.
Exactly. It's like turning a weakness into a strength.
Yeah. That's pretty counterintuitive.
It is.
How did he plan to pull that off, though?
So his plan was to have the federal government assume the debts of the individual states,
Okay.
right? And then issue bonds to wealthy investors to finance that debt.
Okay.
And by doing this, he believed he could create like a powerful force for stability.
It makes sense in a way. If the nation failed,
Right, exactly.
those investors would lose their money.
Yeah, so they'd have a real interest in seeing the government succeed.
So it's a brilliant strategy in a way,
It is.
but I'm guessing there had to be some downsides.
Of course, there's always downsides.
I mean, how do you actually pay for all that debt?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's where the whiskey tax comes in.
Uh-huh. So this is where the whiskey comes in.
Yeah, this is where it all starts.
Okay. I'm starting to see how all the pieces fit together. But why whiskey? Why not tax something else?
Well, whiskey was the perfect target for a few reasons.
Okay.
First, it was a booming industry in the early U.S.,
Really?
particularly in western Pennsylvania, where grain was plentiful.
Okay.
And transportation was really difficult back then.
I can imagine.
So farmers, they would turn their grain into whiskey, which was easier and cheaper to transport.
Right. It's more compact.
Exactly. And it was easier to sell. So it was like a key part of their economy.
So it wasn't just a drink. It was like a central part of life for these folks.
It was essential to their way of life.
Wow.
And whiskey, it was a product made by both large and small producers.
Okay.
So Hamilton figured he could get a decent amount of revenue from this tax.
Makes sense. But, this whole concept of an excise tax might be a little fuzzy for our listeners today.
Yeah, it's not a term we use a lot anymore.
Can you break that down for us a bit?
Sure. An excise tax is basically a tax on the production or sale of a specific good.
Okay.
Like in this case, it's a tax on the production of whiskey itself. I see.
And this was a big deal at the time because most taxes back then were on imported goods.
Right. Tariffs.
Exactly, tariffs. So the idea of the federal government taxing a domestic product, one that was so central to the lives of a lot of Americans,
Right.
it was seen as a huge overreach of power.
Yeah. I'm starting to see how this would cause some friction.
You got it.
It's not just about the money. It's about who has the power to tax.
Yeah, who has the power and how they use it.
Exactly.
And to make matters worse, the way the tax was structured,
Yeah.
it actually ended up favoring those large distillers
Oh, really?
and putting the smaller producers at a disadvantage.
That seems a little unfair, to say the least.
Yeah, you could say that.
No wonder those small farmers were upset.
Right. Imagine you're a farmer. You've just fought a war to escape unfair taxes from a distant government.
Yeah.
And now this new government's doing what feels like the exact same thing.
Right.
You can see why they'd be a little ticked off.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it sounds like this is just the beginning of the story. Oh, yeah.
This clash, this tension between the farmers and the government.
It's just getting started.
It's setting the stage for something bigger.
Oh, yeah. Things are about to get really interesting.
Okay, well, let's take a quick break, and then we'll dive into the next chapter of this whole Whiskey Rebellion saga.
That's good. So we left off with this, powder keg of resentment.
Yeah, these farmers were not happy.
Not happy at all.
Yeah.
And they weren't exactly the kind of folks who just sit back and take it.
Right, they were used to taking matters into their own hands.
Exactly. So what did that resistance look like at first?
Yeah, was it like full-on rebellion right from the start?
Not right away.
Hmm.
It started with the usual tactics, petitions, protests.
Okay, just trying to put political pressure on the government.
Right. Good old-fashioned lobbying.
Yeah.
But things escalated pretty quickly.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah, let's just say that tax collectors became very unpopular.
Oh, no.
Yeah, some of them even got tarred and feathered.
Oh, wow, tar and feathers. That's rough.
Yeah, it was a pretty strong message.
So it sounds like things got out of hand pretty fast.
They did. And what's fascinating is how this resistance kind of evolved.
Okay.
So remember all that distrust of centralized authority we talked about?
Yeah, those folks were not fans of big government.
Well, that led to the creation of the Mingo Creek Association.
The Mingo Creek Association, what was that?
This wasn't just some random group of angry farmers.
All right.
This was a serious organization. I mean, they had their own militia, their own courts, even their own laws.
Wow. So they were basically setting up a whole separate government.
They were. It was like a shadow government controlling a big chunk of western Pennsylvania.
A shadow government. That's a pretty bold move.
Bold and dangerous.
Yeah.
And it gets even more intense. As this standoff with the federal government drags on,
Yeah.
some people within the Mingo Creek Association,
Yeah.
they start talking about secession.
Secession, like breaking away from the United States entirely?
That's right, over a whiskey tax.
That seems pretty extreme.
It does to us now. But back then, you got to remember, this is just a few years after the Revolution.
Right. The idea of states' rights and the right to self-determination was still really powerful.
So for these folks, it was more than just about the money.
Exactly. It was about principle. It was about freedom. They felt like their liberties were being trampled on.
Wow. So we've got a full-blown rebellion brewing here.
We do.
I can only imagine how George Washington must have felt about all this.
Well, he was not pleased. He'd seen firsthand the damage that a divided nation could do.
Right. He'd fought in the Revolution. He knew what was at stake.
Exactly. So he decided to make a statement.
What did he do?
He called up a militia, 12,000 men.
12,000 men.
Yeah, and he personally led them west to confront the rebels.
Wow. He led the army himself.
He did. It's the only time in U.S. history that a sitting president has done that.
That's incredible. So Washington, the hero of the Revolution, marching with an army to put down a rebellion in his own country.
That's right. It was a powerful symbol.
It must have been a tough decision for him.
Absolutely. But it wasn't just about crushing the rebellion.
It was about sending a message. He wanted to make it clear that the federal government had the power to enforce its laws.
Even if it meant using force against its own people.
Even then.
So it was a real turning point in a way. This idea that the federal government is supreme.
It was. It set a precedent that would shape the future of the U.S.
So we've got this massive army marching toward western Pennsylvania.
Yep. Tens of thousands of soldiers.
What happened next? Was there like a big showdown?
Well, that's where things get a little anticlimactic.
Really?
Yeah, as the army approached, most of the rebels realized they were outmatched.
Okay.
So they surrendered.
Oh,
Or they just went back home quietly.
So no big battle? No epic clash?
So there were a few skirmishes, but no major battles.
So the rebellion kind of fizzled out?
In a way it did, but the impact of the Whiskey Rebellion
Yeah.
was huge.
Yeah.
It established the government's right to enforce the law.
Even when people disagree? Even when they take up arms?
Exactly. It was a statement about the power of the federal government.
So it wasn't really about the whiskey after all, was it?
Not really. It was about something much bigger.
Okay.
The power of the government. The limits of individual liberty.
And it also exposed some of the deep political divisions in the young nation.
Oh, absolutely.
I know.
And those divisions would continue to play out for years to come.
So the Whiskey Rebellion might not have been the most dramatic event in American history,
True.
but it definitely had a lasting impact.
It did. It shaped the relationship between the government and the people in a way that we still feel today.
Okay, so let's dive into some of those long-term consequences. So we've covered a lot of ground here. This new nation, this whiskey tax, a rebellion, and George Washington leading an army to put it down. But what does it all mean for us today? I mean, this was over 200 years ago.
That's a good question. Does this rebellion over whiskey back in the 1700s have any relevance to us now?
Right.
Well, Hogland argues in his book that there are some pretty striking parallels between the issues back then and the challenges we face today.
Okay, I'm curious. Give me an example.
Well, think about the debates we're still having about the role of government in a free society. How much power should the government have? What are the limits of its authority?
Right.
Those were central questions during the Whiskey Rebellion.
Yeah. And they're just as relevant now.
Exactly. We see these debates playing out everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Taxes, regulations, healthcare, social programs.
It's a constant back and forth.
It is. And then there's the issue of economic inequality.
Right, the gap between the rich and the poor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The farmers who rebelled, they felt like the system was rigged against them, that they were being unfairly burdened while the wealthy elites in the East were getting richer.
Yeah, we hear a lot about that today, too.
We do. It's a recurring theme in American history.
This tension between the haves and the have-nots.
Right. And the Whiskey Rebellion was an early example of that.
So in a way, the Whiskey Rebellion reminds us that some things never really change.
In some ways, yes. But it also reminds us that change is possible.
How so?
The farmers might not have achieved their goals right away, but they made their voices heard.
Right. They stood up for what they believed in.
Exactly. They forced the government to listen to their grievances.
And ultimately, it led to some changes.
It did. The political landscape shifted. And that's an important lesson.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that democracy isn't a spectator sport.
You have to participate.
You do. You have to be engaged. You have to hold your leaders accountable.
So the Whiskey Rebellion is really a story about the power of the people.
It is. It's a story about standing up for what you believe in, even when it's hard.
Even when it means challenging the status quo.
Exactly. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Whiskey Rebellion,
Yeah.
I want to leave you with a question.
Okay.
What resonates with you about this story? What parallels do you see between the struggles of those early Americans and the challenges we face in our own time?
It's a question worth thinking about.
It is. And if this conversation has sparked your curiosity, keep digging. Explore the lives of Hamilton, Washington, and even those lesser-known figures who dared to challenge the system.
Their stories can teach us a lot about our own world.
They can.
Yeah.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.